The Inflation Reduction Act, which President Joe Biden just signed into law, gives the US a real chance to hit its Paris Agreement targets. The US pledges to, by the year 2030, cut greenhouse gas emissions by 50% from their peak, which was in 2005. Without this bill, the US wasn't even on track to cut emissions 30% over that time period. But now, most models project US emissions to fall about 40% by 2030, and that's a big deal. When it comes to the global Paris Agreement target of holding global warming below 2 degrees Celsius, the bill makes a smaller contribution. Since US emissions are only 12% of the global total, there's a limit to what one American law can do. Nevertheless, the bill will have effects beyond America's borders, making clean energy cheaper all over the world and pushing other countries to take climate action. So the 2 degrees target remains within reach, and that's reason to celebrate. This bill will certainly improve both America's climate reputation and the tenor of international climate talks. US climate envoy John Kerry's had a tough time flying around the world asking other countries to avoid burning fossil fuels. After all, he represents the rich US, which is the world's largest producer of fossil fuels and the country that bears the most historical responsibility for climate change. And for the first 18 months after rejoining the Paris Agreement, America had failed to pass a serious climate bill. Still, this bill is more like the US handing in overdue homework than writing a paper for extra credit. At the COP27 climate conference in Egypt this year, developing countries will still ask the US to meet its promises to send more money for climate finance and to provide funding for loss and damage, essentially climate reparations. In sum, the US is no longer a climate laggard, but it has more work to do to become a climate leader. The US, EU, and China are coming at the climate challenge from quite different starting points. For one, US per capita emissions are about twice as high as those in China or the EU. And the EU, which has more ambitious climate targets, also peaked its emissions in 1990, 15 years before the US. China, for its part, is officially considered a developing country and has promised to peak its emissions before 2030. Now, China is also the world's biggest polluter, but it's sort of operating in a different context. It's at once heavily reliant on dirty coal to fuel its economy and meet its growing need for energy, and a renewable energy superpower in the making that dominates supply chains for technologies like batteries and solar panels. It's also interesting how these three major economies take different approaches to climate mitigation. As good as this new US climate bill is, it's essentially all carrots and no sticks. Compare that to the EU and China, which both have carbon markets. So it remains to be seen whether these different approaches can be reconciled for the creation of a climate club, where major economies would team up and agree to price carbon within their borders and tax imports from outside, and whether the US approach will be able to not only add clean energy to the mix, but also phase out fossil fuels at the required speed.